but customize to your heart's content. And let's go ahead and take a look at some other things kind of outside the TP UI, but ways to access thinking particles. If you go into Customize in Max and say Customize User Interface, there is a group for thinking particles. We have, these are set to my own custom keyboards shortcuts, but you can go ahead and change any of these. We've got Close Properties, which will close the UI, Open Properties to open the UI, and we can also turn the Master Dynamic on or off. This will basically shut TP on or off, just so whether or not the particles are even created or not. And there's also something new called Debug Mode. Debug Mode is especially useful for finding out what kind of information is being passed around. We're going to cover that in another section, but you can see that there's also a shortcut here for that. These are also, of course, accessible from any of the other menus. We have them actually set up here for Debug Mode on-off and Master Dynamic. So you can see if we want to close the TP UI, we can press F6 or F5, and of course those again are based on whatever you have them set up for here under Thinking Particles group. Something else very important, whenever you want to see an actual mesh for your particles, you're going to want to come up here to Master Dynamic and say Show Mesh. That will give you the ability to actually see the mesh in the viewport. Now right now we don't have any mesh assigned to them, so nothing's going to appear. Let's go ahead and we'll remove that section, and we'll go ahead and come up to the operators, into the shape. We'll add a standard shape, make that connection, and we'll assign them to be cubes, and now you can see that we have cubes appearing here. If we want to modify their size, we'll come up to Standard, take a size operator, make that connection. We'll kind of rearrange this so you see a little clearer what's going on. It's pretty simple, of course. All the particles being born out of the position born operator are being fed out and connected to the standard shape and the size. Basically what's happening is standard shape needs to know which particle is he going to modify, as well as size. Size says, okay, well I need a particle connection. Who am I going to be modifying? You can see that when it's not connected, right now our color scheme is set to show an invalid or a needed connection showing up in yellow. And also we get an invalid showing up here. This tells us that the particle system is not going to be working properly because a connection is missing. So we'll go ahead and click and drag that connection, and you can see that all of these are available to us, but we definitely want to connect to the born particles. The particle frame counter is going to output an integer. It's going to tell us how many particles are being born per frame. And the particle animation counter tells us overall, as time goes up by, how many particles has this operator given birth to. So this is kind of the basics of showing the mesh. There's also, we'll turn that off. There's also the display method. The display method is going to control how the particles are displayed, whether none are shown, whether they're shown as flakes, dots, ticks, etc., drops, bounding box, and of course particle ID, and this will show their actual number. Some other things that we can do, let's go ahead and display them as dots, is we have force this setting. Force this setting, what this is going to do is it's going to say, no matter what, I want to display all the particles as dots. And if show mesh is turned on, it's going to say, okay, for all the particle groups, show their mesh. That's what force this setting does. It forces these display options to be applied to all the particle groups. Because you'll see, if you select each particle group, it also has its own ability to specify what display method to use. There's also another option now in TP3 for renderable. So if you wanted these particles here, let's go ahead and just do a quick render. You can see we've got these particles actually appearing. These are the all particles. We can tell they're the all particles partly because we know that from position born, the group being born is all, but also they're white, just like the all group. We could change that and see their change happen right there. They're red, just like all. We can tell all, we could say, do not be renderable. And so now if we render again, that all group is not going to render at all. This is very useful for compositing and matting and rendering out certain passes. But back to the basics. So each particle group has its own display methods you can use. Let's go ahead and get a little fancier. We'll duplicate this creation a couple times. We'll come into the first one. Let's actually reorder our operators here. Red, green, blue. Okay. So in this first creation, we'll go ahead and born red particles. We'll change all back to be white. We'll change red to be red, green to be green, and you guessed it. Okay. So we're going to born red particles. Let's go ahead and change their position. Let's move them further back. And change our camera a little bit here. And then the second one, we'll go ahead and rename this dynamic set just so we know who we're dealing with. The green particles, we're going to born green. Let's take their position and we'll move him up here. And this last creation group will be borning blue particles. Change it from all. You can see that right now they're all, so they're white. We're going to change that to blue. And of course, as we scrub again, we can see those now are blue. But what we can see, let's go back and revisit this force this setting. Right now we're saying show this mesh and force that setting as both. So it's going to force both the dots and the show mesh. If we turn off force this setting, the particle groups themselves are going to determine how they're displayed. So for the green particle group over here, we could say do not show mesh and show as drops. For the blue particles, we could say be ticks, show mesh or not. And for the red particle group, we could say, oh, show as bounding box. And so what we'll have here then is the ability for each particle group to control how it's displayed. But if for some reason you want to override all that, you could always come to the master dynamic and say, okay, force this setting. And this will conform all of the particle groups to display whatever you have set here and whether or not to show mesh.